Chapter 36, Prototype Testing Part 1. December 24, 1922. Ha, ha, achoo. Oh, bless me. Alexander sneezed, then rubbed his nose to relieve the itch. You okay, sire? Roland asked, who was standing by his side. I'm okay, this freaking damn cold is killing me. Snowflakes floated in the air outside the window. The winter in Ruthenia Empire is very cold. When Alexander stepped foot outside the office he was in, the snow started falling heavily. His hair, his clothes, everything is getting covered in a layer of white powder. Alexander shook the snowflakes off of his body and went up to the open area of the St. Petersburg Naval Base. The St. Petersburg Naval Base is commissioned 3 years ago under the administration of his father. It's part of the Baltic Fleet. But the reason for his visit to this naval base is not to sightsee naval warships. Instead, they were here to test new equipment the infantry would use. One of the reasons he chose this base is because of the distance. He has a date with Sophie later to celebrate Christmas and wouldn't want to get late as the nearest military base around the capital is 30 kilometers away. He found out that Ruthenia Empire celebrates Christmas on a different date, the nearest military base specifically on January 7th. In the open area, Alexander was approached by a man in his 60s, wearing a military uniform. Good morning, Your Majesty, we are honored by your presence here in my base. The man was Vladimir Sadasky, the chief of the General Staff of the Imperial Ruthenia Armed Forces. Is everything in place? Alexander simply asked. Yes, sire. Vladimir turned around and held his hand out as he pointed to the 10 men in military uniforms lined in a row. This is the finest soldiers I can think of in Ruthenia Armed Forces. The 10 soldiers stood firm and held their gaze on Alexander. As he looked around him, he could feel the respect from them and it made him feel uplifted. Very good, Alexander spoke as he walked towards the lines. He stopped right beside one of the men. They are the first men to receive his inspection. Alexander took a look at their uniforms. They wore a paprika, greenish tunic and pants khaki, knee-length boots, and also a large greatcoat. It's an outdated uniform that's been used for 20 years. Alexander not only wanted an upgrade of their equipment but their uniform as well. Maybe after he finished his prototype computer, he will work on a design. Alexander nodded in satisfaction as he returned back to where he was earlier. Seconds later, a low grumble of an engine sounded from a distance. Alexander turned his head and saw 20 military trucks. It stopped near them and the soldiers began to unload the load of the truck. There were boxes that contains new weapons that will replace their bolt-action Mosin Nagant rifle. After a minute of unloading the boxes, Alexander clapped his hand to gather everyone's attention. Okay, gentlemen, listen up, Alexander shouted. Everyone in the vicinity immediately became serious and quiet down. He continued. Today, we will test a new prototype weapon that will replace the standard issue bolt-action Mosin Nagant. I want you to be aware that this operation is extremely classified, so everyone around here who says a word about this operation will be tried for treason, which is punishable by death. There are only a few of you, so it'll be easy for us to track you down should you dare to disobey the order. Now you might be wondering what type of weapon we will be testing, so much that I had to place strict measures. Well, gentlemen, the weapons that I'm going to show you have not yet been introduced in foreign countries. The Deutschland, the Britannia, the Francois Republic, they don't have this weapon. We are the first and this might be our upper hand. Alexander motioned his hand to one of the soldiers who unloaded the box to open it. The soldier nodded in acknowledgement and opened one box. The soldier grabbed what was inside and handed it to Alexander. The soldiers who were called to participate in this clandestine weapon testing had their mouths slightly dropped at the alien design weapon in Alexander's hand. Prototype weapon number 1, Alexander raised the Heckler & Koch HK-33 in the air, showing it to them clearly. This piece of art is hard to manufacture, but thanks to the efforts of the arms manufacturer Tula, they were able to produce 20 of them in just 3 weeks. Alexander began explaining the basic information about the HK-33. The weapon is much shorter than the Mosin Nagant, almost half of it. The barrel is 390 mm, the magazine can hold 30 rounds of ammunition, and has a maximum rate of fire of about 750 rounds per minute. It has an effective firing range of about 400 meters. The weapon's name is the TSLR-33. T stands for Tula, SLR for self-loading rifle. Alexander continued his explanation of how the weapon is assembled, some of its features, and also how to handle it properly. The soldiers who watched him perform basic handling was dumbfounded. Their first impression was, how did their new emperor know a lot about firearms? Even the chief of the general staff were astounded. The young emperor's explanation of the weapon is what shocked them the most. A gun can carry 30 rounds in a single loadout, compared to the Mosin Nagant who can only hold 5. If the emperor's words are true, then this new weapon would revolutionize warfare. I want you to form a line and get each one for yourself, Alexander commanded. After that, I want one of you to fire the weapon at a target in that distance. Alexander pointed to a target on the far side of the open area. The soldiers formed a line and got their HK-33 assault rifles. They took a hold of it, checked the balance, and tried aiming at it at a distance. Their impression, it is slightly lighter than a Mosin Nagant, and the designs somehow charmed them. It's salient as they haven't seen a weapon with this design before. After 1 minute, Alexander took the lead. This is going to be different than the Mosin Nagant you're accustomed to. This TSLR-33 is an automatic rifle, unlike the Nagant where you load the rifle using a clip. In this rifle, we use a detachable box magazine, similar to the pistol like the M1911 pistol of the United States. Now for the curtains call. Alexander trained the weapon at a target dummy at a range of 100 meters. Oh, before I forgot, this weapon has 2 modes of operation: the semi-automatic and full automatic. We're going to use the semi-automatic first. Watch and learn. Alexander breathed deeply for a brief moment and then pulled the trigger. The TSLR-33 shot an empty cartridge out of the ejection port on its left side. The noise from the rifle's shot made the soldiers flinch and reflexively held their ears for a brief moment. After firing a single shot, Alexander flicked the selector switch, changing it to full auto. The gun continuously fired, roaring endlessly. The noise was tremendous, a machine gun-like sound that echoed in their ears. After 15 seconds, he emptied the magazine with 100% accuracy. All bullet hits their target. He still had it in him. The soldiers were on the edge of their wit. It really did spew 30 rounds. The chief of the general staff's face was in a state of shock. This weapon will truly revolutionize warfare. The emperor was on fire. As you can see, now this is where it gets tricky. Alexander switched back to semi-automatic and then tapped the barrel of the TSLR-33 to eject the empty magazine. After that, he inserted a new one. This rifle has a magazine that can hold 30 rounds of ammunition. A typical Mosin Nagant has a clip that can only hold 5 rounds of ammunition. It's a vast amount of difference. Think how revolutionary it is. Where each soldier can kill 30 people in one go. That's why I exercise strict measures to protect this weapon from falling on our enemy's hand. The soldiers applauded and cheered in excitement. Alexander has already placed measures to protect his future military techs by implementing a new law where the arms industry is prohibited from selling weaponry to any foreign nation without the state's permission. By giving them the rights to produce the weapons he designed as long as they don't break their words, and lastly by threatening. It's an effective measure he can think of for now. Espionage could also serve as a problem for him. To solve that, he's going to increase the budget of the Minister of Internal Affairs, who will then implement stricter measures for foreigners to step foot on Ruthenia's soil. Is he earning from the weapons he designed? Yes, through royalties and rights, which he can use to fund more projects, specifically on weapons development. Okay, it's your turn now. Take position, Alexander shouted his order. The soldiers took their TSLR-33 and loaded it with a magazine and aimed it at the target on the far side of the open area. Fire, Alexander shouted. The sound of gunfire echoed through the mountain. The soldiers continued firing until they emptied the magazine. They are also in a state of shock. A minute passed and they were still standing there in a daze. Alexander clapped. Excellent, you're all quick learners. Now for the second prototype. Alexander motioned to the soldier once again and handed him a new different type of weapon. The soldier's eyes were fixed on the weapon Alexander is holding. This second prototype, I call it the TAR-47, let's continue, he said as a smile crept across his face. Creator's thoughts. Sorry I'm just diamond, sorry I'm just diamond. Suggest alternate name. The soldiers who were attention gasped and chatted with one another, sharing their thoughts about the new prototype. We will be testing the TAR-47 today. The same as the TAR-33. I want each of you to take a weapon, load yourself with a magazine and aim the target dummy. The soldiers lined up to pick up the new prototype they'll be testing and head towards the firing range to prepare themselves for conducting a test. A minute passed and the soldiers were all ready. Before firing the new weapon, one soldier nudged one of his comrades and said something. Do you think it's a little heavier than the TAR-33? The soldier held the rifle up to check its weight, then he arrived with an answer. I agree, it's slightly heavier than the TAR-33. Not only that, the bullet is larger than the TAR-33 rounds. Can't wait to try this out. The soldier let out a chuckle as he trained the barrel of the TAR-47 at the target dummy. They waited for the signal to shoot, which is the Imperial Prince, Alexander. Fire, Alexander shouted, giving them permission to shoot. The soldier pulled the trigger and suddenly felt a force pushing on his right arm, forcing him to shoot higher than the targeted dummy. Alexander confirmed by watching them, it's a little hard to control due to its strong recoil, so you'll have to compensate accordingly, Alexander advised. Even though it's heavier, the soldier's impression is still very good, especially the one who fired it first. The power of this weapon is still more than the TAR-33. I get more satisfaction from firing this weapon, it's a little sweeter to the eye. The chief of the general staff was in a state of admiration. The ear-deafening burst and its penetration power and the fact they can shoot it continuously. If only the army has this weapon during the Russo-Yamato War, they would have overwhelmed the Yamato army and forced them to retreat, or even won the war. Makarov's eyes flickered to the young prince. He has always been loyal to his fatherland, the Ruthenian Empire, and would do everything to protect its sovereignty and honor. When the news echoed across Ruthenia about its defeat from the Yamato, his heart shattered, and the reason for it is because the former ruler of the Ruthenia Empire, the prince's father, was focused on oppressing the people who speak out to him or those who are wanting more rights. Seeing that the prince is making efforts to stabilize the country moved his heart, and his attention to the army is truly appreciated. He's confident that in the future, the Ruthenia Empire will have its comeback and shock the world. You have my respect, young prince, Makarov muttered under his breath solemnly. The soldiers resumed firing their weapons, exhausting them with ammunition as the ejection port spat out empty shells one after another, littering the ground. Once again, the soldiers were in a state of amazement. Though not all, some of them were stretching their shoulders due to the strong recoil of the weapon they aren't used to carrying. After the test, they even glanced at their current service weapon, the Mosin Nagant, contemplating if it will be useful to them now that a new type of rifle is introduced. Okay, return the weapon to where you took it from. Alexander gave his orders, the soldiers followed and went back to where they took the weapons from and stand by for orders. 2 weapons tested, 2 to go. They took a quick break before starting again. This time, they will test another kind of assault rifle, the FN-FAL and the AR-15. The test took 20 minutes, and once it was completed, the soldiers began picking up the spent shells on the ground and placing them in an empty box. Once they were finished, Alexander nodded and clapped his hand to get their attention. Okay, we're all done here, Alexander announced. I want to congratulate you all for the good work you've done for today and the time you took to test these new weapon prototypes, Alexander concluded and turned to face Makarov. General, we will supply you with these weapons for further testing. You can only choose 1 or 2 of these weapons to replace the current service rifle of the army. So choose what you think is the best and we'll have it mass-produced. Though it's easier said than done, Alexander still has a long way to go to mass-produce them. Even though the current arm manufacturers can manufacture it, but the production process is slow simply because the assembly line is not built to procure those weapons. The reason why they can only choose one or two types of weapon to replace the Mosin-Nagant is because the weapon that has been tested earlier has different production process, and so is their ammunitions. In order to produce them in large numbers, Alexander will have to share a manufacturing technique with his major arms manufacturer and have them adopted fast. The second is building a CNC machine. It's the reason why Alexander is rushing to build a computer prototype that uses vacuum tubes or transistors. Not only it will help the manufacturers to build complex parts of the weapon, but it will also help them in procuring complex machinery that will be used on war machines such as tanks, vehicles, aircraft, and the like that require precision that no humans can't possibly achieve. Programming and coding would pose no problem for him, as he already has one in mind. But that is for another day. Yes, Your Majesty, we will choose among the best of this weapon that we think will be useful for the army. I appreciate that, Alexander replied and glanced at the far distance. A silhouette of a warship, possibly a dreadnought or a cruiser, loomed on the horizon. Alexander turned to face Makarov once he noticed that he was looking at it. Once he is done with the army, he'll proceed to the Navy and the Air Force. Oh, before I forgot, General. What is it, Your Majesty? Can you come to my palace in 2 weeks along with the Admiral of the Navy and the General of the Air Force? It's about the procurement program that I plan to introduce in the armed forces of the Ruthenia Empire. I will need your counsel about that matter. As you wish, Your Majesty. I will notify them at the earliest notice. Makarov promptly replied as he bowed. Excellent, we'll be going now. Thank you. Alexander saluted. Makarov and the soldiers nearby returned the salute, holding their rifles in their hands as they watched Alexander and his security detail retreat towards their convoy. Alexander entered the vehicle, followed by Roland, who sat on the front seat. He signaled the driver and the convoy to move, and they slowly took off the military base. So, how do you like the show? Alexander asked Roland with a smirk. It was a good weapon, sire. It's a revolutionary one that can fire like a machine gun. It will surely strengthen the infantry's effectiveness in times of war, Roland commented, looking at the rear-view mirror. Well, it's just the start. We will be developing more in the future. That means a lot of work for me, Alexander said, peering through the windows. Roland smiled and said nothing more. So, Roland, since you became my bodyguard, you haven't seen any action, right? That's right, Your Majesty, Roland confirmed. Since he was transferred to become the Imperial Prince's head of security, Roland hasn't seen any action. Most of the time, his work involved him watching over and protecting him from threats that can harm him. But, I will pray to keep it that way. Boring is always best. Indeed, boring is always best, Alexander chuckled. He pulled out his itinerary book to check his schedule. It was loaded. He has a meeting with his Council of Ministers and the CEO and engineers of arms manufacturers. All in all, it'll take most of his afternoon time. Later in the evening, Alexander will have a date with Sophie to celebrate Christmas together. Roland, take a detour, take me to a jewelry shop that produces the highest quality of diamonds. I'll make it special for this day. Roland nodded and relayed new instructions to the driver. Chapter 38, Passion for Computers. One of the rooms in the Winter Palace has been repurposed for Alexander's work. It was a newly installed drafting room, where he spent most of his time working on a new design he'll introduce in this technological Dark Age alternate world. Inside the drafting room, Alexander was busy doing business as usual. Drawing on a bond paper that varied in different sizes. For now, he's designing what would be the first most reliable and efficient computer in the world. Leaning over to his paper, Alexander drew across the paper with a T-square, straightening the line he had drawn. T's a schematic view of the computer he was designing. The current computer he's working on was as tall as a person and consume a lot of space, similar to the computers that existed in the 1940s and late 1950s. With a single stroke, he had finally done it. Alexander stretched his arms outward and wiped the sweat off his forehead with the back of his arm. Even though the weather is cold, he can't help but sweat when he's at work. Okay. 20 redraw to go, Alexander said enthusiastically, but deep inside, he was slowly dying. The fact that he has to redraw the schematics 20 times is really killing him. Without the computer-aided design software, he'll have to design everything in an old-fashioned way until he makes one. There is no zoom in or zoom out. Working on complex machinery such as the second-generation computers involves small parts that need to be enlarged in order for other engineers to have a clear view of it. To do that, he'll redraw it again. This process is repetitive and tedious. And that's also the reason why he respected engineers, architects, and designers who weren't born in the computer age, where one won't have to suffer from this process. He'll eliminate that by creating a computer similar to the electronic drafting machine that was created in the late 1950s and a sketchpad, the first computer-aided design software, but in his own version, which will be faster, easy to learn, and cheaper than the old model in his past world. To give you an idea of how a computer was used in the past, allow me to tell you a story. From the 1930s to the 1950s, engineers communicate with the computers using punched cards which are coded to perform a specific task, such as calculating the trajectory of naval artillery to create a firing table during World War. And in the post-war, new technologies such as jet aircraft, helicopters, and new engines are born. Now that is something that can't be done by hand. Well, they did, but there were a lot of mechanical failures and design flaws, even killing a pilot that test flight a helicopter. The reason helicopter blades were complicated is that the balance weight was installed on the front end of the blade to help with the tilt up for the pitch angle. So in the late 1940s, the United States Air Force needed help with ultra-precise wing construction. Sir John T. Parsons pitched his design of a machine that will help them create helicopters, rotors and aircraft wings that is entirely made by machines and free of human intervention. He won the contract and was tasked to make it a reality. And in reality, he did. In 1952 a machine named Motor-Controlled Apparatus for Positioning Machine Tool was born. However, there is a limit to that. You see, the machine gets its order from punch cards, which are just a set of instructions. Now why am I making a big deal about this? Because numerically controlled machines ran on data from punched cards largely made using a painstaking manual process. They have to develop something new to reduce this tedious process. Introducing an EDM or electronic drafting machine created in 1962. It was a revolutionary step toward the progress of CNC technologies. You see, people can write programs using letters and numbers with punch cards as their medium. Each group of holes represents one letter in a word that you tell a computer what to do next. However, there are so many things that people do when they communicate with each other that don't fit into a computer too well. Want an example? Here we go. Let's assume that we're talking on a phone and I wanted you to draw an American flag. Now you know what I'm going to tell you since you're familiar with it. But if we're going to discuss this over the telephone, I would have this problem of saying, well, first you have to pick up a pencil and go to the left low-hand corner of the screen and start drawing a horizontal line. Draw 8 inches, then go up 1/4 of an inch and draw a horizontal line in the other direction. As I tell you these detailed instructions as you go up through the flag and where the stars were and so on, and eventually you'd be able to draw the American flag from my instructions, or not. You see, what happens is probably you're going to call me back and say, why don't you draw the US flag on a piece of paper, mail it to me, so I'll know how to draw it more easily. And here you see a man needing to use graphic communication to tell another man what he wants. Fun fact, they actually did draw an American flag using codes, and it takes a lot of pages to get there. And that is the very thing Alexander has to create. Now there is a prerequisite. He has to improve the designs of the current cathode ray tube televisions, which will be a crucial part of the design. To fund this project and not be completely reliant on his annuity or royal treasury, he has to set up his own manufacturing plant under his name in all aspects of the industry, the raw materials industry, manufacturing, and construction, service industry, everything. The income generated from those business will be used to fund his next projects. It'll be a waste if his million of money will just sit there in his bank account after all. He desperately needs this machine to make some of his designs into reality. It's the reason why a Bell UH-1 is only just a dream to him because of the lack of modern computing equipment. It took him 6 hours to complete his initial designs and then a television that he'll plan to commercialize. He got carried away and designed more such as the heat pump, microwave ovens, refrigerators, and toasters, which are more advanced than the current ones. His lips curled into a grin as he finished the designs that were spread across the drafting tables. As a businessman himself in his past life, he knows how to exploit the system. Invent something new that is considered rudimentary and every year, introduce new kinds of stuff or innovate what was created to make customers come back for you. Just like how Apple introduces a new brand every year. The handheld phone is a thing of the future. There's no infrastructure in this world that can support the tech such as cellular tower. At least not yet. He'll take it slow and work his way up, making the Ruthenia Empire a producer of better technology and machinery that will dethrone the Deutschland Empire as the world's science finest. He looked at his wristwatch and saw the time. It was 9 p.m. in the evening. Only 30 minutes left before his date with Sophie started. Shit. He cursed inwardly and headed to the door, grabbing a coat from a clothes hanger and leaving the drafting room. He took a hot bath to wash the grease off his body and to warm himself up and donned his expensive suits that are tailored by Sardinia Empire and his recently bought diamond ring as a gift to her for Christmas. Her Christmas specifically. Ruthenia celebrates Christmas on a different date. This is to respect the customs she had grown accustomed to. As a man, he must be considerate when it comes to his partner, especially if that girl will be the most important person in the future of the Ruthenia Empire. Combing his hair in a formal style and making sure his suit is impeccable and also pairing it with some very nice shoes, he noticed his reflection in the mirror and smiled in satisfaction. He's ready for this. Leaving his bedroom, Roland, who was stationed by the door, handed him a bouquet of roses, Sophie's favorite. Just in time, Roland. Alexander smiled as he received the flower. Sniffing it and a fragrant aroma filled his nose. She'll surely like this. Looking great today, sir. You look handsome, Roland praised, making Alexander winked in pride. I get that all the time, making me used to it. They laughed at one another. So, good luck out there, Your Majesty. I got this. Alexander smiled and head out towards the special dining hall of the Winter Palace. Creator's thoughts. Sorry I'm just diamond. Sorry I'm just diamond. Sorry for the late chapter, I had to focus on my assignment in AutoCAD and luckily I was able to pass it. Toss some powers tones to support this book. If you find grammatical error, word usage error, or something like that, please do let me know in the comment section below. Chapter 39, Everlasting Mark. Ear off reporting, mature content detected, proceed with caution. Alexander arrived at the special dining hall exclusively prepared for the royal couple. Upon gracing the Imperial Guard with his presence to serve as his entrance, Alexander adjusted his three-piece suit and sauntered further into the glamorous hall lit by extravagant lights iced with crystals that shone radiantly, making the hall glowed. Stepping further, the gentle melodic jazz produced by the musicians at the far back corner of the hall. He spotted his fiancée alone in the middle of the room, sitting by a table. The blonde Bavarian beauty is currently enjoying the jazz music with a glass of wine, sipping it and tapping her feet along the tune. She wore a white silk dress that was made by the best fashion designer in the world, the Sardinia Empire. It's very thin enough to be transparent if she moves in the right direction. She wore a white necklace in the center, making her look more elegant and refined. His breath caught in his throat. She looks every bit like a princess out of a storybook. She looks perfect. Her beauty and grace can be compared to that of a goddess. She spotted him from afar and waved at him with a welcoming smile. Alexander walked slowly toward her and handed him the bouquet of roses. Sophie accepted them happily and sniffed the petals of the flower. Her face flushed a light shade of pink. "Thank you," she said softly. "You're welcome." They sat together at the edge of the table and enjoyed the warm and lovely scenery around them. Food has already been served on the table. Alexander looked at it and saw a perfectly grilled steak slathered with sauce. The aroma wafting from it filled his nostrils and he could feel a tingle running through his spine. There was a bottle of wine and a crystal decanter beside it. "So, how's work, Alexander?" Alexander's eyes flickered to Sophie as he got asked a question. However, instead of looking at her face, he was distracted by the great bosom revealed by her silk dress. "Isn't her dress too revealing?" He cleared his throat. "Work is fine," he replied nonchalantly as he averted his gaze away from her alluring chest. "She's been wearing thick dresses and outfits since he met her. He has no idea that it was that great." He gulped inwardly, hoping that she didn't notice that. Alexander cocked his head to the side as he can't help but be bothered by her melancholic expression. This day should be a moment to celebrate, it's Christmas yet, she didn't look happy. "Is something the matter?" Alexander asked, noticing the long face in her with concern. Sophie looked away for a moment and sighed. Alexander could only feel his worry grow at the sound of Sophie's sigh. "Did something happen when she's alone? What could it be perhaps?" he asked himself. "You see, I've been watching over you, since the time she stammered bashfully, her face flushed red. "We kissed." She finally let it out. Alexander's brows furrowed, confounded by her words. "What do you mean?" she continued. "Alexander, aren't you working too much?" Alexander finally understood where she is getting into. "Every morning, you have a daily meeting with your ministers, and in the afternoon you sort documents and papers, and beyond that, you were either in your drafting room or having a meeting with some businessman. Earlier it was the former. I saw you drawing things I can't understand, and even though I can see a hint of frustration in your face, you were still engrossed in finishing it," she added. Alexander's eyes widened. She's watching him the whole time? "Why do you have to work yourself too much that you don't have time for yourself?" Alexander smiled. "I'm fine." Sophie turned her eyes to him. "You're not fine. You're working way too much. It seems like you're taking the burden of the whole world on your shoulders. Alexander, what you have to realize is that you can't take everything on yourself. You have to delegate the tasks to others. You're the king, after all, you cannot shoulder everything. You're working like a machine." "Do I work like that?" Alexander let out a forced chuckle. "It may be the case. The thing is, he can't delegate the task to others simply because they don't know what to do with it. What he is doing is introducing a new concept that this world considered revolutionary. So he has no choice but to work thrice as hard." "Could you imagine how worried I was when I saw you work late at night?" "Alexander, please, you don't have to push yourself too far. Take it slow." Alexander sighed. She has a point, maybe he is doing things too fast and is working himself to death. Well, this is the only option he can see for the Ruthenian Empire to grow, but if he died before it was realized, then it will be all wasted efforts. Alexander nodded. "Fine, I'll take care of myself from this day forward," he assured, yet Sophie didn't look entirely convinced. "No, after our dinner, I want you to come with me." The dinner ended in a way he didn't expect, making him unable to give her the diamond ring he bought for her this Christmas. "He'll wait once things settled down." "Where are you taking me?" Alexander can't help but asked as they walked along the hallway. Sophie didn't respond to him, and Alexander continued following her until they reached a certain door. Alexander took a quick glance at it. It was very familiar. "Isn't this your bedroom?" Sophie gazes down as she opened the doorknob, obviously giving him a cold shoulder. The door creaked as it opens. Sophie grabbed his arm and tugged him inside the room. Alexander let out a startled gasp as he was taken into her room. Sophie locked the door behind them. This is the first time he's in her bedroom. She released her grip from his arm and turned her body to face him. "Sophie? Why are we in your room?" Alexander asked, glancing around the room, avoiding eye contact. Sophie ignored it and walked forward. Seeing that, Alexander walked a step back. However, she didn't stop. She continued onwards until Alexander's back hit the wall. "Sophie?" Alexander asked, feeling a little nervous. Sophie leaned forward, her eyes fixed on his. She shuffled a bit closer to him, and he can feel his heart almost leaping out of his throat. She's so close. Close enough that she could kiss him if she stood on her tiptoes. He can feel her breath, her perfume, her warmth. His brain slowly processed what was happening before him. "Say, Alexander." She finally spoke, "Why don't we sleep in the same room together for now?" Alexander's eyes widened, he stood dumbfounded at her proposal. Who knew that this girl would ask him that directly? Her face was beet red and her eyes started to flicker away like a flame. Maybe it took a toll on her for saying that. Why? Aren't we a couple? We are a couple yet we don't act like one, she said and continued. So for this day, why don't we do what couples do? Huh? Alexander couldn't follow. Having enough of his dense reaction, Sophie grabbed his right wrist and opened his hand, then pushed his palm up against her soft breast. What are you doing? Alexander asked. He tried to pull away, but she pushed on the back of his hand. Just this once, Alexander. Let me comfort you, as your wife. Alexander could feel his face warming up and his heart beating faster. The thought of having sex made his shaft twitch. Are you sure about this? Sophie nodded bashfully. This is my first time, so please be gentle. She placed her hands on his shoulders and found his lips with hers. She moaned softly as he breathed into her mouth. Alexander stood frozen as her tongue brushed against his lips. He opened his mouth and their tongues twirled around, exploring each other and sharing their saliva with each other. He wrapped his arms around her waist as he felt his knees go weak. He closed his eyes and enjoyed her soft kiss as he nibbled on her lower lip. He groaned. He gave in to the temptation and was tempted to do more as his eyes fell upon her slender neck. She smelled so good, making him crave even more. His lips traced her neck from her soft flesh to her delicate, pale ear. He closed his eyes as he enjoyed her scent, making him feel more stimulated. She gasped when he sucked on her earlobes. Ah! She moaned. He sucked harder, making her bite her lower lip, her moan becoming louder, and every time she let out that adorable sound, it made Alexander addicted too. While his lips is having her way, his hand slid down to the hem of her dress and crawled his finger inch by inch, tracing along the lines between her thighs. Sophie started to tremble, even more, her sweet moans turning deeper and more sensuous, sending a cold shiver down Alexander's back. Noticing that Sophie is squirming more and more, making her dress slide down her shoulders and having her breasts spill out from her dress, Alexander finally decided to spread the fabric away from her body. She gasped when he cupped her breast and massaged it. Each squeeze of his hand made her moan. She wrapped her arms around his neck, pulling him closer. Ah, ah. He heard her moan every time he sucked on her breasts. Without hesitation, Alexander lifted her up and carried her to her bed. He gently lay her down. Her hourglass figure splayed out on the bed was enough to set his mind ablaze. Under the bright chandelier, her naked body, flushed in faintly cherry blossom pink, was revealed. The delicate line of her neck, her slender, feminine arms, and, the part of her that seemed the most contrasting, her breasts was too tempting, enough to make his mind ablaze. He forgot to breathe at the wonderful sight. You really are beautiful. Sophie smiled shyly and lay down on the bed, her arms stretched toward him. Come closer. He dropped down beside her on the bed and kissed her vigorously. His hand went back to massaging her breasts. He lowered his head and sucked on her chest, making her moan even louder than her head tilted up, her tongue lolling out of her mouth. His hand slid down to her abdomen. He hooked his fingers into the waistband of her panties and slid them down her hips. Ah! She gasped when he slid her panties down her legs, exposing her womanhood to him. This was it, a few more steps and they are going to do it. But is it okay to do it? Is it okay to go further than sensual kissing? Alexander crawled atop of her, his eyes fixed firmly on hers. Sophie. He breathed heavily. I can't hold it anymore. Can we do it? Yes, she said as she nodded. Please be gentle on me, this is my first time. With those words, he was triggered. He didn't hesitate anymore. He spread her legs wide and had his way with her. His lips locked on hers again, their tongues tangled to and fro, his hands stroking her body, her small moans spurring him on. They embraced each other strongly and deeply that nothing seemed clear anymore. Alexander lost all of his rationality as his carnal desire took over his body. Nothing is important to him now but to make her happy. In the midst of their loving caresses, Alexander vowed to himself that he would not make her regret her decision of becoming his queen. In the morning, Alexander woke up to the sound of an alarm clock. His arm was wrapped around Sophie's waist, and her smooth back felt soft and warm against his hands. She snuggled up closer to him. He smiled as he leaned closer to her ear and whispered, "Good morning." Sophie smiled sleepily and whispered, "Good morning. Is your body okay?" "It still quite hurts. It might be hard to walk without feeling the pain." "Alexander, you're surprisingly brute. Even though I told you to be gentle, but, you could have told me to stop, right? I even asked you if you want me to stop but you shook your head. Well, that's partly true." She averted her eyes and looked embarrassed. "Anyways, I'll have to prepare for work now. Today is an important meeting with my ministers." As Alexander was about to stand up, Sophie grabbed him by the arm, stopping him. "Wait," she said, pulling him close and without hesitation, sucking his neck like a vampire. Moments later, she pulled her lips away after planting a mark on his neck. She licked her lips and said, "There, a proof of our love," she giggled. Chapter 40, Sweeping Reforms. Dressed in his usual uniform, Alexander walked along the hallways on his way to his office. Roland was escorting him and can't help but notice something odd in his gait. "Sir, did you trip or something?" Roland asked with his head cocked to the side. Alexander halted his step as he turned around to face Roland and simply shook his head. "No." Roland hummed, seemingly not convinced, then noticed something reddish spot on his neck. Alexander noticed it and quickly hid it by straightening the collar that framed around his neck. I see. Roland's mouth made a somewhat meaningful smile. At his expression that looked like he had guessed, beads of sweat formed on Alexander's forehead. "Why are you grinning, Roland?" "Nothing, I was just thinking your grace had so much fun last night." "You really are an observant fellow, Roland. Because if you hadn't noticed I would have you fired." Alexander gestured, to which Roland let out a chuckle. "Anyways, did the ministers arrive?" "Yes, sir. They are waiting for you in your office," Roland informed, and they resumed walking. Upon entering his office, 10 ministers donned a military jacket and greeted the young prince with a bow. "Good morning, your majesty, we hope the day is treating you well," they intoned as Alexander walked over to his desk. "I am having a great day," Alexander said, sitting on his chair. At ease, ministers. Upon his orders, the ministers gathered in front of his desk carrying brown manila envelopes. "Let's get started. What's on our agenda?" Prime Minister Sergei nudged someone on the arm. Alexander glanced at the man. It was the Minister of Agriculture. The minister who got nudged quickly came to attention and walked forward to hand a manila envelope to Alexander. It was thick, probably 100 pages. So he didn't bother opening it. Instead he asked the Minister of Agriculture, "So what's this about?" The Minister of Agriculture cleared his throat before speaking. "Sir, it's a land reform bill that was passed by the Imperial Council with an overwhelming majority vote." "Explain it to me." The minister nodded. "Yes, your majesty. The Imperial Council had been trying to find a way to distribute the lands in a better way. Since the lands that have been distributed to the commoners were way too small for them to have a sustainable income. We hope that with this amendment, the lands that are being distributed for the commoners would help the economy and livelihood of the people, which in return would strengthen our empire." "How?" Alexander replied. The Minister of Agriculture spoke again. "Most of the lands were controlled by the landlords, that's over 100 million hectares of land. The bill proposed that the state we buy 20% of those lands each year, then sell it at an extremely low price to the farmers who worked them. So basically, this is a land redistribution, right?" The Minister of Agriculture nodded. "Yes, your majesty. With this bill, our agricultural productivity will increase, strengthening food security and lessening poverty for rural households, and facilitating industrialization for your planned infrastructure bill by feeding the cities." Alexander's lips curled into a smile as the effect of the agrarian reform satisfied him. As he remembered, there was a time when the peasantry demanded land. So the Imperial Council prioritized them first, huh? In that case, I shall sign the bill. By signing the bill, Alexander, the head of state of the Ruthenia Empire, effectively made the new land reform law passed into effect. Since the Imperial Council had worked hard for this and are expecting immediate results, Alexander grabbed a pen and signed the document. With that, the bill has passed and became a law. The Minister of Agriculture smiled after seeing that document was signed. Alexander returned the manila envelope to him, which the Minister of Agriculture received warmly. "Okay, who's next, sir?" Vladimir Borisov, the Minister of Finance, raised his hand and walked forward. "This is a new tax legislation, also passed by the Imperial Council." Alexander received the brown envelope and he started perusing it. Since it deals with the tax, Alexander couldn't just sign in carelessly, he has to study and understand the content first. The new tax bill was proposing a new unified tax system, and the rates are determined by the income bracket of the citizens. The new tax bill hoped that doing so will enable the government to tax more fairly. Alexander stood up and took a look out the large windows of the office. He watched the snowflakes fall on the ground and swayed by the wind. Alexander nodded in approval. "Okay, I shall sign it." He opened the envelope and took the document inside. Then signed it carefully. Just like before, he returned the manila envelope to the Minister of Finance, who received it with a bright smile. He scanned the room and asked the question, "Any other bills that require my signature?" "Why yes, Your Majesty, we have been trying to draft that for a long time. We hope that this will put an end to the outdated educational system and teach students a more modern method." Alexander shifted his attention to the Minister of Education. "Go on." "Yes, Your Majesty. So the education reform is a comprehensive plan to reorganize the education system in Ruthenia Empire. In our old education system, only the nobles or the elites are eligible to pursue education, the commoners and peasants aren't. With this reform, we will be empowering the Article 14 about education, science, and technology, arts, culture, and sports, where the state shall protect and promote the right of all citizens to quality education at all levels, and shall take appropriate steps to make such education accessible to all. Our new education will be composed of 5 levels. Primary education K6, lower secondary education, junior high school 7 to 10, upper secondary education, 11 to 12, vocational, and lastly tertiary level, which is separated into 3 parts, undergraduate, graduate, and doctoral. From K-12, education for the mass will be free, and is eligible to apply for school vouchers and scholarships to help them pursue higher education. We are also coordinating with the private schools about the implementation of the new standardized education system. That's all, Your Majesty." The Minister of Education concluded. Alexander smiled after hearing that. It's been their main agenda to change the education system of the Ruthenia Empire ever since the daily meeting with the Council of Ministers started. The population of the empire is at 160 million people, yet most of them are illiterate. No one can build a modern economy with a crumbling infrastructure and illiterate people. Though there has been a word from his ministers that giving the common people access to education will bite him back in the end. He'd say it's bullshit. He's not scared of the people who are thinking, in fact, he appreciates it. Even if they were enlightened of their tragic fate as a common people since the foundation of the empire, that's up for them to speak up against the government. It is their rights that he promised to them after all. Alexander grabbed the pen and signed the education reform bill. The new education system will start in the next school year. "Is there anyone else?" Alexander asked. No one voiced out or raised their hands. Alexander returned to his seat and propped his chin up with his hand. "Okay, now that's settled, let's talk about my infrastructure bill. Sergei, what's the progress?" "The voting will start in 4 days, sir," Sergei said. "The Imperial Council who are working on your bill will give us a copy 2 days before the voting. That's for you to see the amendment in the bill." Alexander nodded, acknowledging the bureaucratic process. His eyes flickered to the Minister of Internal Affairs. He has something to talk to him about. But before he can open his mouth, Sergei interjected. "Sir, you also have to check the budget for each ministry, or else we won't be able to pass it to the Imperial Council and risk a government shutdown. Is that so?" Alexander tilted his head to the side, pondering. When there was no legislative body, most budgets are approved by the ruling monarch, i.e., him. Now that there is one, each ministry will have to present its budget to the Imperial Council for their approval. Having a government shutdown in his first term would be humiliating. Very well, give it to me by tomorrow. The ministers bowed their heads in unison. His gaze is back into the Minister of Internal Affairs. What's the progress with the Black Hand, Sir Caneve? You only have 7 days left. We are tracking the trail now as we speak, Your Majesty. We assure you that we will catch them before New Year's Eve, Caneve answered, sweating. You better be, Alexander said coldly. Or else you'll lose your position as my Minister of Internal Affairs. I am fully aware of the ramification of my position if things aren't done in an intended way, Your Majesty. Dmitri bowed solemnly. Excellent, now set that aside. How about we conduct our daily meeting? The ministers agreed and began their session, which lasted for over 2 hours. Once the meeting was concluded, Alexander promptly left his office and asked for Roland, who was standing idly by the door since his boss entered. What is it, sir? Get the car ready, we're going somewhere. Where is it, sir? Roland asked. The Central Bank of St. Petersburg. Chapter 41, Withdrawing Money for a New Business. The snowflakes outside the Winter Palace gradually slow down in their descent to the ground, falling on Alexander's shoulders and atop his Ashoka fur hat. The Winter Palace and the surrounding area were covered in silence. The only source of the noise was the engine of his state car that stopped in front of him. One of the Imperial guards opened the door for him. Alexander stepped forward, entering the vehicle as a small smile graced his face. Once he was seated inside, the car began moving towards the St. Petersburg Central Bank. Roland, who was in the driver's seat, asked Alexander, who was peering through the window, enjoying the white scenery. Sir, may I ask the reason why you want to visit the Central Bank? It's a personal business that I've been thinking of months ago. Personal business, huh? Well, sir, a piece of advice. When you are planning to visit a place, please tell me in advance. I can't have my men scout the roads we'll be taking in just short notice. Especially when the trip is covered. I can't afford to draw unwanted attention, Roland, specifically for this trip. As I've just said, it's personal. We go to the bank and leave the bank. Easy as that. Roland let a white misty smoke out of his mouth as he sighed. Alexander could never understand the danger he was in, especially when the Black Hand terrorist group are still active. Okay, sir, but please promise me that in the future, you'll tell me in advance. Alexander simply nodded as he acknowledged Roland's reminder. He understands why he has to take this seriously, as it is his job to protect him from any unwanted threats lurking around the capital. 15 minutes later, they arrived at the Central Bank. Before stepping out of the vehicle, Roland turned around and faced Alexander and handed him something. Alexander arched a brow upon seeing the item in his hand. It was a revolver. This is a precautionary measure, sir, Roland said, motioning Alexander to grab the revolver from his hand. Alexander slowly reached out to the gun and grabbed it. Why do I need this? Alexander asked while looking at the revolver. Because, sir, there's only the two of us. I believe that you know how to use it, right? The shooting skill that you displayed during our visit to the naval base shows that I can trust you carrying that. I understand, Alexander nodded, putting the gun inside his trench coat. And also stay close to me, sir. Who knows what danger is lurking around here? I didn't have the time to scout the perimeter to assess for a potential threat. You know the drill, sir. I know, I'll keep myself close to you at all times, Alexander said. Okay then, let's go inside, sir. Alexander nodded in agreement and got out of the vehicle after the short brief. Looming over them was a neoclassical building. This was the Central Bank of St. Petersburg. Underneath it was a vault that contains the riches of the Romanov family. Alexander and Roland walked inside the bank. There weren't a lot of people inside the bank, making it a convenient time for the both of them, knowing that they won't spend more time waiting in line. Welcome, gentlemen, to the St. Petersburg Central Bank. How may I help you? The receptionist immediately stood up from his seat and greeted him. I want to speak to the bank manager. Is he available? Yes, sir. May I know the purpose of your visitation? Alexander grabbed something from his pocket and slid it over to his desk. The receptionist glanced at the paper and upon looking at it, his eyes widened in shock. It was the royal seal of the Romanov family. The receptionist rubbed his eyes and looked once again at the paper and at the man in front of him. It was the Imperial Prince, the new emperor of the Ruthenian Empire. Realizing his identity, the receptionist immediately bowed. Your Majesty. Please forgive me for not recognizing your presence immediately. I'm deeply sorry for my rudeness, Your Majesty. It's all right, I just want to speak with the bank manager, Alexander said. Your Majesty, please follow me. The receptionist led Alexander and Roland to one of the elevators that were near their position. The three of them entered it and went up to the top floor where the bank manager's office is located. A few minutes later, they arrived at the entrance of the bank manager's office. The receptionist told the two to wait outside before entering the office. Sir, the Imperial Prince of Ruthenian Empire wished for an audience with you. The Imperial Prince? The bank manager, who was sitting in his office, stood up from his seat as he heard the receptionist's statement. Then why are you keeping them outside? Let them in. Yes sir. The receptionist stammered out a response and notified the two that they can enter. Alexander and Roland entered his office and removed their ashaka. The bank manager bowed his head and speak. Your Imperial Highness, I'm honored by your presence here in my bank. How can I help you? I would like to make a withdrawal, Alexander answered. Do you have the keys, sire? I do. Alexander pulled 3 gilded keys out of his pocket and showed them to the bank manager. Seeing that, the bank manager nodded. Please follow me, sir. The bank manager led them to the underground floor of the central bank, where a thick metal vault is located. May I borrow the keys, sir? The bank manager asked. Alexander took out the key that he showed to him earlier and handed it to him. The banker carefully inserted the keys into the 3 keyholes in one of the hundreds of steel boxes, which made a slight clicking sound. Inside those the box was a piece of paper containing a combination number that will open the vault. The manager then proceeded to open the vault using the numbers shown on the paper. Seconds later, the vault made a loud sound as it was unlocked and the thick metal door opened. Alexander and Roland looked on in awe as they saw the amount of gold in the vault that stretches further inside as if there was no end. The three entered the vault and walked further inside. On every side, there's a pallet of gold bullions, glimmering brightly against the dim light of the room. Alexander couldn't help but admire the magnificent sight in front of him. His heartbeat was faster with each passing moment. With these assets, Alexander could build factories and materials needed for his future inventions. How many tons of gold do I have here? Alexander glanced at the manager. All in all, 3,000 tons, sir, the manager answered. 3,000 tons of gold? Alexander's jaw dropped, surprised at the overwhelming wealth of the Romanov family. He quickly performed a mental calculation to figure out its worth. It would be $162 billion in today's money, an enormous sum of money for this time. This is only the gold of the Romanov family and is different from the Ruthenia's empire gold reserves. But he knew better that he can't just withdraw all of that. He'll just take the amount he needs to commence his long-term plan. What's your name, sir? It'll be weird if I call you bank manager. Alexander glanced at the bank manager. My name is Pavel, sir. Well, Pavel, it seems like you're going to work twice as hard as I'll be withdrawing 30% of it. For now, I will prepare the necessary documents right away, sir, and shall have the account manager here to sign them within the next hour or so, Pavel said, bowing. I appreciate that, Alexander responded smilingly. The moment Pavel stepped out of the vault to carry out his work, Roland walked up to Alexander. Sir, just curious. What will you do with that enormous amount of money? I'll be starting company, Roland. It's a waste to keep them in here and not use it, don't you think? A company? What kind of company do you have in mind? Is this something that you've planned before? Roland asked, intrigued. Alexander thought about it for a second before answering. Yes. I'm planning on entering the electronics, automobiles, and oil industry. They generate a lot of money. Roland let out a gasp and added another question. Do you already have a name for your company, sir? Alexander hummed in thought. He haven't thought of a name yet for his company yet. It'll be stupid to name his company similar to his company from his past life. So he thinks of a new one. A name came up in his mind. The name of my company will be Dynamic Systems. Chapter 42, Damsel in Distress. Alexander stayed at the bank for more than 30 minutes to process his withdrawal by filling out forms and changing the combination code of the vault for security purposes. Once the process are complete, Alexander and Roland left the central bank with a copious amount of money. With this capital, Alexander can now make his inventions into a reality to stimulate the economy of the Ruthenian Empire by making products that a consumer would die for. His plan involves acquiring private-owned properties such as automobile companies, electric companies, electronics companies, shipbuilding companies, munitions companies, pharmaceutical companies, and the like from the wealthy elites. From there, Alexander will reconstruct the assembly lines, reform the system, and implement his future CNC machine that he'll finish in the next month. As the two walked along the snow-filled sidewalk, heading to their car, Alexander noticed some noise coming from an alley. Roland, who's been perceptive of his surroundings, quickly took position by going up in front of Alexander. "Sir, stay behind me," Roland ordered. Alexander obeyed his chief of security, who has a serious expression on his face. From this moment, Alexander will follow Roland's command for security purposes. Roland checked the alley and saw 6 men surrounding a woman, blocking her escape. Alexander also came by to check and encountered an unpleasant scene. "Woo! Aren't we lucky, a fine woman wandering alone in the street." "Hey girl, want to come with us and have some fun?" "Hey pretty lady, don't be scared, we won't hurt you. We just want to play a little." "I already said no, I've refused you so many times already. Please, let me go." "Don't say that darling apostrophe tilde, you're breaking my heart here." A girl about the same age as Alexander was getting caught up in a group of men that really stood out. The place they were in right now is in the vicinity of the central bank, and there were a lot of people walking by. To think that they would try to seduce a girl out in the open like this is truly concerning. "Sir, what's your order?" Roland took a quick glance at Alexander, who was deeply in thought. "To think that this is happening in my country, right in front of my very eyes," Alexander sighed as he opened his eyes and shot Alexander a serious look. "Roland, how confident are you in your hand-to-hand combat skills?" "I can take them down all by myself," Roland confidently replied. "I see. Then, let's defuse the situation first. If things didn't turn peacefully, we'll have to take drastic measures." "Understood, sir." The 6 men continued to harass the woman. The girl didn't like it and tried to get away from the men, but they persistently surrounded her. When Alexander and Roland looked around, there were people in the area, but everyone pretended not to see them. Finally, one of the men grabbed her arm. "Come on, let's go." "I don't wanna. Let go of me, please. Help." When the girl let out a distress call, Roland stepped in. Alexander watched from a safe distance. "Excuse me." "Huh?" The men all turned to look at Roland. Their collective gaze was sharp, and it was clear they were looking down on him. "This is one tall tough-looking MF. What do you want?" one of the men growled. Alexander stood firm, his eyes unwavering. "Can't you tell?" The lady didn't like it. "Leave her alone at once or else." "Or else what?" one of the men challenged. "You may be tall and tough, but it's 6 versus 1, the odds are against you. If you don't want to get hurt, you should get away before we change our mind." "Not until you leave her alone." "Okay, don't say we didn't warn you." One of the thugs approached Roland and walked around in a circle. Meanwhile, Alexander stood by and watched from the distance and grabbed one of the passers-by by the arm. "Can you do me a favor? Call the police for me, will you?" The passerby nodded and dashed off. Back in the alley, Roland felt a hard tube pressing against his neck. The thug is armed. Roland turned, clenching his fist as he raised his knee and slammed it into the thug's gut. Roland grabbed for the pistol, wrenching it from the thug's grip, firing 3 rounds in the process. Roland grabbed the gun, unclipped the ammo magazine, and slammed it into the thug's leg. The goon cried out in anguish, but Roland silenced him with a punch to the groin. He dropped the thug into the dumpster. The 5 thugs looked in disbelief after their comrade got knocked out as easily as that. One of the thugs flicks over a knife, brandishing it, then rushed at Roland. As he closed in, Roland deflected the blade and countered with a punch to the thug's head. Taking advantage of his opponent off balance, Roland delivered a kick to the goon's chest, sending him to the ground. "Who's next?" Roland challenged. The goons were frozen stiff in their spot for a moment. They were used to intimidate the weak and helpless. But this time, they are facing a big man that is proficient in combat. "Watch out!" Alexander's voice came from the alley entrance. Roland instinctively turned as the thug charged him with a knife in hand. Roland reeled backward, avoiding the wild slashes. He blocked, grabbed the man's, twisted it, and rammed the blade at the thug's other hand. The goon let out an agonizing cry as Roland showed the goon who reeled back to his other comrade while he groaned in pain. Now knowing that the man they are fighting with is a legit fighter, they abandoned their current strategy and the 4 of them charged toward him at once. Roland braced for the worst as he saw 4 of them sprinting towards him with killing intent. Gah! He blocked a wild roundhouse kick from one of them. The goon tried to follow up with a kick to his head, but Roland caught it. He then stomped on the goon's foot, forcing him to back off. The goon staggered for a moment, but he quickly recovered and lunged at Roland again. However, Roland deflected the incoming arm, and delivered a powerful palm strike at the goon's jaw, knocking him out. Roland caught the other thug's wrist and swept his legs out from underneath him. The goon crashed to the ground, his head snapped back as Roland's powerful strike sent the thug's head backward, effectively knocking him out. While he managed to fight off 2 of the goons and put them down, the other 2 continued attacking relentlessly. Roland found himself engaged in a fist fight with one of the thugs. The thug attempted a flurry of punches, but Roland expertly blocked each strike and returned with a punch of his own. But Roland noticed that the goon is slowing down and is starting to get tired. Roland seized the opportunity and delivered a palm strike, followed by an uppercut, knocking out the goon. Luckily, the last thug is still in front of him, and Roland is in a good position to take him out. Roland deflected the last thug's incoming punch, and delivered a powerful kick to the goon in the stomach, followed by a jab under the chin, putting him out of commission. With all of the thugs taken out, Roland took a moment to catch his breath and glanced over his shoulder where Alexander was watching. Alexander raised a thumbs up, impressed by his combat ability. "Thank you." Roland turned as he saw the girl approaching him. She seems to be either in her early 20s or late teens. She's wearing a blazer that is worn over a dark dress and a skirt that reaches over her knee. Her navy blue hair was tied into a bun, giving her an impression of a young rich daughter of nobility. "It's no problem," Roland replied. "Were you hurt?" "I should be the one asking that. Are you hurt, mister?" "No, this is nothing. These goons didn't even land a hit on me," Roland haughtily said, looking down at the downed thugs. "How can I repay you, mister?" "It's no big deal. You should be careful in the future." As the girl was giving her thanks to Roland, one of the goons that got knocked down, get to his feet, and rushed at him with a knife raised high. With Roland's guard down, he was late to react. But suddenly, the goon's knife was sent flying as a deafening roar echoed in the alley. "Eh?" The goon's eyes bulged, dumbfounded. Roland slapped the thug in the face, sending him down to the ground. His eyes flickered to the entrance of the alleyway and saw Alexander with his revolver trained in his direction. A tendril of smoke still danced on top of the barrel of the gun. Alexander holstered it and approached the 2. "The police should be coming any minute now," Alexander notified. "That's great, we shall wait for them to come and get out of here, sir." Alexander nodded and glanced at the woman they had just saved. "Are you okay, miss?" The lady struck her head upward to thank him. But before she can utter her words, she gasped as her eyes met his. She took a step back, making Alexander wonder. "Miss, it can't be." "It can't be," Alexander repeated, cocking his head to the side. Looking at her face more closely, memory flashes before his eyes. This girl looks familiar, like he had met her before. But before Alexander can fully remember her identity, a group of police emerged from the alleyway. "Raise your hand." "Oh, officers. I'm glad that you arrived. These thugs here," I said, raised your hand. The police officer repeated, their pistols trained on them. What a mess. The officer muttered as he surveyed the scene. It's okay. Roland spoke out as he pulled something out of his pocket. It was an identification card. My name is Roland Makarov, the Chief of Staff of the Ruthenia Imperial Guards. Roland introduced himself while showing off his ID card. One of the police officers took his ID to verify its authenticity. Sir, it's real. Finding that out, the senior police officer ordered his men to stand down. Are you all right, sir? The senior police officer asked. Yes, we're fine. Look, I'm happy to report the incident to you, but I have to leave with my... Roland paused. He can't just tell he will leave with the Imperial Prince of Ruthenia Empire. Noticing that, Alexander stepped in. I'm also part of the Ruthenia Imperial Guards and are expected to arrive at the Winter Palace in 30 minutes. Alexander told a lie. In that case, sir, you are free to leave. Don't worry, sir, once our shift is done, we'll head to the police station. For now, please take care of her. She was harassed by these mobs. The senior police officer glanced at the lady, and then nodded. Okay, sir, be careful on your way to the Winter Palace. The road is slippery. Alexander and Roland nodded and began leaving the scene. As they got to the entrance of the alleyway, Alexander stopped in his track and glanced over his shoulder, looking at the navy blue-haired girl, and muttered under his breath. You looked familiar. Chapter 43, Good Mood. On their way back to the Winter Palace, Alexander was tapping at the windowsill of his car as his mind wandered beyond the life of the original Alexander. The way the girl reacted the moment he saw his face was something that piqued his interest. It was a reaction that told him that the two were acquaintances. Though Alexander couldn't remember clearly how, where, and when they contacted one another. As he continued tapping his fingers on the windowsill, Roland, who was driving the state car, couldn't help but ask about this current predicament. Is something troubling your mind, sir? He asked with his eyes fixed on the road. The girl that we saved earlier, she looked familiar, but I can't remember any details resembling her in my mind. Alexander replied, his eyes gazing through the window, watching the snowy scenery passing by. Do you want me to look up her identity when I arrive at the police station? No, it's fine, don't bother. It's just me rambling out my thoughts. Okay, then sir. You know what, a name would do. Maybe I can remember her once I remember her name. Understood. The two remained silent as they continue their journey toward the Winter Palace. As they arrived at the Winter Palace, Roland exited the vehicle, walked around the car, and opened the door for Alexander. Alexander straightened up his coat as he stepped out of the vehicle. He faced Roland, who closed the door as he left. Thank you, Roland, I think I'll be safe here, Alexander said, returning the revolver to Roland. I'll be back once I give my report to the police, Roland said, grabbing the gun from Alexander. Okay, be careful on your way there. Thank you, sir. Roland. Alexander nodded his head and Roland walked back to the driver's seat and drove away. Alexander stopped in front of the main door, found two Imperial guards, and opened the door for him. A moment after, a young lady with a height of 149 centimeters and a tall blonde-haired woman appeared from the other side. Welcome home, dear brother. Welcome home, dear. It was Anastasia and Sophie. Are they perhaps waiting for him all along? Alexander smiled as he knelt down to receive Anna's embrace, receiving her warm welcome affectionately. Sophie was the next one to give her a nice welcome. However, the two don't know whether they are going to kiss or hug. They haven't set up a lover's greeting yet, so it went awkward. Alexander was going for the kiss on the cheek while Sophie for the hug. After a brief stare down between the two, they went for a kiss on the cheek. Welcome home, Alexander. How was your trip? It was productive, I guess. After exchanging brief words at one another, Alexander's eyes flickered to Anna, who was watching them since. Where are your sisters, Anna? Sister Christina is having her portrait drawn while Sister Tiffania is at her tutor session, Anna enthusiastically answered. So both of them are occupied, huh? Alexander thought to himself. Very well, Alexander. Sophie called, tugging his sleeves gently. Alexander hummed as his eyes flickered back to Sophie. There's someone who wants to meet you. They say they have an appointment with you. They also said they are the prospectors that you called. I remember them. Thank you for notifying me, dear. Sophie's cheeks blushed, her eyes twinkled and her lips slightly pursed. It's no problem. Let's go meet them. As Alexander was about to head to his office, Anna grabbed him by the hand, stopping him from his track. No, you can't, brother. Dr. Dmitri said he has something to tell to you. Dmitri? Your royal doctor? Yes, brother. He said he has some good news. Anna's eyes lit up with excitement. It's probably about her condition getting good from the medicine his brother created for her. Fine, I'll meet with your doctor first. Mind if I tag alone, Alex? Sophie asked. I see no problem with it. Alexander slowly began walking as Sophie quickly followed behind, trailed by Anna. Arriving at the door of the royal doctor's office, Alexander knocked. Alexander could hear hurried footsteps pacing across the floor. The door was opened where the doctor stood before him. Ah. Your Majesty. I've been waiting for you. My lovely sister here said that you have good news for me. Alexander asked as he stepped into the office. Anna followed while Sophie stood outside the door for a moment as her eyes wandered around the room. Then entered. I do. Dmitri walked over to the table and pulled out the chair. Please sit down. Alexander took his seat and went straight to business. So what do you want to tell me? It's kind of short, Your Majesty. What I want to tell you is, your sister is cured. Dmitri announced with a jovial smile. Alexander's eyes widened and his eyes began shining. His fists clenched tightly as a smile emerged on his face. Oh, that's amazing. Alexander doesn't know what is the appropriate way to react. He just saves Anna, one of the wishes of the original Alexander. I'm glad. It was quite indeed, sir. She tested negative in tuberculin skin test and blood test for tuberculosis. She's cured, sir, with the medicine you created. Sophie gasped softly from behind. So Christina is telling her the truth that Alexander was the one who created a cure for Anna. A smile appeared on her face as she finds it endearing. That's amazing, brother. You've done it, Anna shouted proudly as she hugged her brother. Alexander hugged her back, his eyes were glistening with tears of joy, but he was confident that he can control himself and he won't shed them. The streptomycin and isoniazid you synthesized are truly effective against tuberculosis. Your Majesty, this could potentially save hundreds of lives. You just gave hope to those people. Alexander was humbled by his words. It was indeed one of his plans in the first place, that if the cure is effective, he'll share it with the world. He wanted the people who are suffering from the disease they considered a death sentence a chance. I know, that's why I'm now giving you permission to publish the paper about streptomycin. Let the world know that the Prince of the Ruthenia Empire just created a cure for a deadly disease. He haughtily declared. Of course, this cure could also be used for political purposes. His image and reputation would skyrocket if the Ruthenian populace find out that their new emperor is a prodigy. Of course, sir. With these discoveries, sir, you can even win a Nobel Prize for medicine or physiology. Alexander chuckled at the thought. Him? Getting a Nobel Prize in this world? Good thing that this happened in another world different from him, or else he'll be ashamed of himself since he just used the process and manufacturing created by Dr. Selman Walksman. After a short talk about the good news, Sophie guided Alexander to his office where the prospectors are waiting for him. Along the way, Sophie initiated a conversation. You were amazing, Alex. Alexander scoffed proudly. Didn't I tell you that I'm an excellent engineer? Huh? Sophie was lost there. How did an engineer create a medicine that no doctor in the world could achieve? Well, I'm a very versatile engineer. Sophie pouted. Alexander could hear her cute humming noise coming out of her mouth. He chuckled softly. I'm serious, I'm really impressed by what you did, Alex. Sophie complimented again. Alexander halted his step and looked at her. Thank you, dear. Silence fell between them. Oh, looks like I've arrived in my office. Alexander breaks the ice. Thank you, I'll take it from here. After saying that, Alexander entered his office, leaving Sophie outside, who muttered, You really are a mysterious person, Alex. At his office, Alexander strode over to his desk, ignoring the prospectors who were standing and bowing. Let's get down to business. I'm quite in a happy mood today, so let's this quick. Alexander took a grip of a drawing tube under his desk. He opened it and unfurled it over his table. The prospectors looked at the table. It was a world map with red marks on some specific regions. I want your team to prospect oil in this region. Alexander pointed at the map. It was the Timan Ridge, West Siberian region, the Caucasus region, North Caspian Basin, Middle Caspian Basin, Azov-Kuban Basin, Dnieper-Donetsk Basin, Volga-Ural region, Baltic Depression, Pripyat Basin, and North Sakhalin Basin. The part that he just pointed out on the map is the well-known oil reserves in his world. Assuming that the geography is the same as here, the prospectors would find oil there. He's certain of it. Creator's thoughts. Sorry, I'm just diamond. Sorry, I'm just diamond. Lame chapter name. Couldn't think of a better one, so forgive me. Chapter 44, The Embarrassing Past. The veil of the night has darkened the surroundings of the Winter Palace. The golden hue of electric lights that lined the exterior walls of the extravagant estate glowed under the gloomy evening, radiating magnificence. In one of the rooms of the Winter Palace was a brightly lit office where Alexander was currently working. Busy as usual, Alexander scribbled on his papers, trying to complete his daily task. Being an Imperial Prince plus the future Emperor is a very taxing job. More taxing than he was once when he was a CEO in his past life. Normally, he would relegate this task to his trustworthy and capable personnel while he just enjoys his life in his penthouse, watching the view of the New York skyline. But in this world, there were no people that can keep up with his work, especially on his inventions. He's been meeting with countless engineers and architects about his new designs, but their reactions were the same: awed, speechless, and astounded. They still need guidance, but some of them are picking up what he was trying to point out. Still, they are not cut off from the job. He can't blame them as they have different expertise, and the thing he's planning on introducing to this world hasn't realized its greatness. A technology that will transform how information is transmitted and make the world even more connected with one another. Television. Most people in this era haven't heard of the word television. The way information was disseminated was through newspapers and radios. In this world, radios are the dominating technology in a media empire. It was a lucrative business that made some pioneers in the radio industry garner a huge amount of money. How? Well, people from every household who'd like to get the latest update on big events congregate around the radio. It was also a form of entertainment. So imagine how would the people react when they can not only hear the words coming out from the speaker but see the images that go along with the signal in real time? That's where the television came in. An invention that could make the radio obsolete. Now, he had consulted this idea with some of the engineers in the Ruthenian Empire, but none of them catches his interest. A gut feeling that they aren't the right person for the job. One of the engineers he met told him that there was a boy from the United States who pitched the very same idea as his. Obviously, it piqued his interest. So he had arranged a meeting with him 2 weeks ago. He'll arrive today. Of course, he can create the television by himself. He even created one when he was in high school for his science project and has the materials to build it in the palace. But as the head of state, Alexander couldn't just neglect his royal duties for the industries he was planning on creating. He has to find a people that could handle the business for him to lessen the load. Someone who is not only capable but also understands what they are working with. And last but not least, trustworthy. While he was scribbling on the paper, a knock on the door caused his attention to shift away from the papers. He called out, "Come in." The door creaked as the door opened. Alexander looked up from his desk at the man entering his office. It was Roland. So he just got back from the police station. Roland walked over to Alexander's desk, carrying a brown envelope. "The thugs that harassed the woman earlier have been detained, sir," Roland reported and handed the envelope to him politely. "This is all the documents I can find about the woman you asked me to check." Alexander took the envelope, taking out a file. It was the birth certificate of the woman they saved earlier. As he perused the content, Roland started speaking. "Her name is Elena Serebrikova, daughter of Baron Serebrikov. She works at an admiralty shipyard as a secretary," Roland said. Alexander nodded, turning the pages again, stopping at an old image. "She's strikingly familiar," Alexander commented, looking at the picture of the woman. Roland raised an eyebrow. "I'm sorry, sir. I felt like I've met her before." Alexander's memories flitted back to 2 years ago when he sneaked out of the palace and headed into the city to have fun with his friends. When they were at a bar, a girl with navy blue hair and striking blue eyes caught his attention. And on that day, something happened between the two. Something he doesn't want to remember. Realizing what Alexander has done in that time, Thomas clenched his fist, snapping the pen he was holding in half. "Oh fuck me," he breathed as the memory played in front of his mind. "Why? What happened, sir? Did you remember her?" Roland asked cautiously. Alexander shook his head, his expression blank. He can't believe that the original Alexander would do such an indecent thing to someone he just met. He wanted to curse at Alexander, but Thomas couldn't. If he were to meet him again in a dream, he would surely rant about his behavior. "Sir, are you okay? You look pale," Roland asked. Alexander sighed, taking out the rest of the papers inside the envelope. "Thank you, Roland. I think we're done here. Please show yourself out." Roland bowed, turned around, and left after shutting the doors behind him. He didn't notice Alexander's face contorting in anger. After Roland leave the room, Alexander leaned his forehead against the desk, breathing heavily. He could feel sweat running down his forehead and neck. There was nothing he can really do now. What's done is done. However, this past would have a catastrophic effect on his reign if it were to leak out to the public. It must be kept under the rug and never be disclosed to anyone. For a few minutes, Alexander stared at the ceiling as thoughts ran in circles in his head. He needed answers, and fast. This situation has to be covered up soon or risk the consequences of the public finding out. An idea popped into his mind. He'll just meet her personally and then discuss the matter for closure. Heaving a sigh of relief, Alexander picked up the phone that was ringing on his table, pressing a button to answer the call. "What is it?" "Your Majesty, Sir Philip Ainsworth has arrived in the Winter Palace. Where do you like us to take care of him?" his manservant asked, voice crisp and professional. Alexander closed his eyes, thinking about it. "Send him to the guest room. Tell him I'm going to meet him tomorrow morning. I can't meet him today due to sudden circumstances." There were a few seconds of silence before the manservant spoke again. "Very well, Your Majesty," then hung up. With that, Alexander set down his telephone, placing both hands together. His head drooping downwards, he mumbled to himself, "I have to tell her." Along the gilded hallway of the Winter Palace, Alexander walked drearily as the event of the past still haunts him, making him uneasy. He entered his bedroom, removing the trench coat and shoes that he wore. He sat down on the sofa and rested his elbow atop his thigh, placing his hand on his temple. While he was sulking, disappointed at Alexander, the door suddenly opened. He moved his head to check and saw Sophie standing there, in a rather alluring attire. She was wearing what seemed to be a white nightgown made of the finest silk that only went down to a little above the knee. Her golden hair swayed to the side as she walked over towards Alexander. "You're quite early?" Sophie said. He swiveled around, sitting on the bed to face her, his arms crossed. He didn't answer, but he could see the curiosity in her features. She knows something was wrong. Before she could say anything, Alexander spoke up. "I want to talk to you about something." Sophie sat beside him and the nice aroma coming from her hair wafted into his nostrils. She smelled nice, he thought. She shifted closer to him so their faces were inches apart. "What is it you wish to talk to me about?" she whispered, placing a hand on his hand. He took a moment and finally replied, "It's about what happened 2 years ago, about me doing something unspeakable things." Sophie blinked, waiting for what he will say next. And Alexander felt a shiver run across his spine, his heart racing fast. It's harder than he expected. "Well, there is this woman, 2 years ago. I told you before, right, during our time in Vienna. When I talked to you about my past." "Alexander," Sophie stroked his face. "It's okay, tell me, please." Alexander inhaled deeply, gathering up enough courage to speak the truth. "The woman that I am talking about, something happened between us. Alexander flinched in anticipation, as he waited for her reaction. Sophie didn't speak but merely stayed quiet as she waited for him to continue. I should have known better than it's wrong. I was drunk at that time, with the events happening to me back then, my mind was reeling. I couldn't even tell what I did after that. Sophie's eyes widened at his confession, her expression frozen in shock. She finally understood what Alexander was trying to say. In short, he did it to that woman. I have no excuses for what I did back then. It was wrong. You have the right to be angry at me. Sophie paused, not knowing what to say but to tell him the truth. I'm not angry at you. Alexander's expression became perplexed. You're not angry at me? Sophie shook her head. No, I'm not. Alexander's heart skipped a beat, not expecting this from her. I'm not angry at you because we weren't in a relationship at that time. I don't care about your past, what's important is that you're here staying by my side and telling me the truth. Alexander's eyes widened. He's taken aback by her confession. He looked into her eyes and was surprised he was not angry. He can see the sincerity in her eyes, and at that moment, he felt a flicker of hope in his heart. He gave a small smile. Really? Sophie smiled lightly and nodded her head. Alexander couldn't discern whether she is happy or sad from her facial expression alone. He literally just told her that he had sex with another woman and she's saying it's okay because they weren't in a relationship at that time? If it were in reverse, Alexander would be heartbroken hearing that. There's no way she can smile after knowing that. Are you really okay, Sophie? Alexander asked tentatively. Yes. I am, truly, Sophie responded softly, her expression beginning to soften, as she caressed Alexander's cheek tenderly. Her touch felt so warm, that it brought peace and tranquility to him. As he relaxed at her touch, it made him want to share the feeling of happiness she gives him with her. Alexander pulled her closer to his and hugged her lovingly. He pressed his lips onto her forehead. It was a reassuring smile. I may have done something terrible in the past, but I swear to you that I won't ever hurt you, Sophie. Sophie smiled and wrapped her arms around him tightly in return, nuzzling her face into his chest. I know you won't. Chapter 45, A Revolutionary Product. A loud buzzing noise reverberated around the room. Alexander slowly opened his eyes as the sudden noise roused him from his sleep. He squinted and rubbed his eyes. To his side was his beautiful fiancée. Her lovely beautiful face and golden hair glittered under the sunlight that is streaming through the windows. Despite the loud ringing sound of the alarm clock, she was still sleeping soundly. Alexander stared at her for a minute before giving her an affectionate kiss on the forehead before getting out of bed. For breakfast, Alexander ate dessert for his breakfast. A cuisine from Austrian Empire, Schokotorte. After eating his breakfast, Alexander prepared for his usual busy day, taking a bath, donning his imperial uniform, and heading to his office for the Council of Ministers' daily report, which would take 2 or 3 hours depending on the contents. After his meeting, Alexander would conduct his daily exercise, running around the palace grounds to increase his cardio, and later proceed lifting weights at the palace gym for muscle development. After his daily exercise, Alexander would have free time in the afternoon. Whether he spends it with his family or completes his projects is up to him. Today, it was the latter. Alexander has a visitor from the United States, a potential candidate for the role of a CEO for his Imperial Dynamic System Corporation, Electronics Division, thus requiring him to finish the prototype of television that will be commercialized in the Ruthenian Empire and the whole world. He already has the material he needs to create a single working prototype, and it took him 5 hours to complete. Once it was finished, Alexander then immediately headed to his room to take a shower and change his dress. As he completed all of the preparations, Alexander heads to his workshop where he'll wait for Philip. 10 minutes later, a knock on the door was heard. Alexander gets to his feet and the blonde-haired young man enters the workshop. Whoa! Philip let out a gasp as his eyes wandered around the room. It was full of heavy-looking machines lined on the walls and a lot of electronics tools he often sees in factory workshops. Are you Philip Ainsworth? Alexander called out to the younger man, walking forward. Philip snapped back from his oar at the place and nodded. Yes, that's me. You must be the future emperor of the Ruthenian Empire. Nice to meet you, sir. I forgot. Where are my manners? Philip gave a polite bow as he chuckled in embarrassment. Alexander gave a soft grin. You may rise, Mr. Ainsworth. It is all right to call me Alexander for this occasion. If you say so, Sir Alexander, Philip said, raising his head, but he didn't dare to look directly in his eyes as he believed it would be considered rude or preposterous for a common man like him to exchange looks with the powerful figure in Ruthenia. Take a seat, Sir Philip. Alexander gestured towards one of the chairs. Philip nodded politely and sat down. He began fiddling with his hand in nervousness, rapping his fingers atop his thigh as his eyes wandered around the room. The two men remained silent for a few moments until Alexander cleared his throat, breaking the silence between them. So you are Philip Ainsworth, a farm boy from the city of Rigby in Idaho State of the United States? Is that correct? Alexander inquired, reading the file he had in his hand. Yes, Sir Alexander, Philip answered, rubbing his hand along his pants nervously. Alex smiled slightly at his response. An engineer working in the Ruthenia Empire told me a lot about you, Philip. That you created a new technology that could rival the radio industry in New York's fair? Alexander remarked in curiosity. Is that true? Philip smiled shyly. Yes, it is. I call it television. Alex arched an eyebrow and looked up from his folder. How did you come up with that idea? Philip scratched the back of his neck shyly. So I was reading a lot of books about the greatest mind in the world. And in this book, there was a line in the book stating schemes to create television are not true. Now every previous attempt has failed as the greatest mind in history have tried to perfect this technology. That line got me thinking, what if we can add moving images by capturing a picture electronically, as a microphone does with sounds? Of course, it was a silly idea of mine at first, but when I was preparing for the day to do some field work, inspiration struck me. Ho! Alexander mused, leaning forward as his words piqued his interest. What is it? It was the plough lines of my father's field, he revealed. A plough line? Alexander repeated with confusion evident in his tone. Yes, sir. As I was standing before the field, an idea struck me, that it would be possible to build a device that would scan an image line by line, the same way our eye scans the pages of the book. Hearing his explanation, Alexander's lips curled into a smile, seemingly impressed by Philip's thoughts. The way he describes the idea works similarly to how television worked. What happens after? Alexander resumed their discussion. At first I pitched it to my science high school teacher about this device that can electronically scan an image dozens of times per second, and transmit those images across the airwaves at the speed of light. Alexander was impressed yet again by his knowledge. How long have you been working on this project? Since I presented it to my high school teacher. Philip hummed in thought. 5 years. And at what age did the idea of creating a television strike your mind? When I was 12 years old, Sir Alexander. Alexander gasped in surprise. The thought of someone working on it since they were 12 seemed incredible, but this person managed to come up with a revolutionary idea of his own? This man is a genius in the making. Based on his story alone, Alexander could tell Philip has a natural talent for science, an important asset. So I pitched my prototype to the investors and planned to invest $25,000. And did you accept it? Alexander asked. No, sir, they were asking for 70% share. Far from what I'd initially proposed, which was 49%. What happened? Alexander questioned curiously. They backed out, Sir Alexander. It was a take-it-or-leave-it deal. I know the importance of money to make my dreams into reality. But it's just unfair that they'll be owning 70% while I only get 30%, it just seems wrong. Philip frowned in disappointment and guilt washed over him. Well, Sir Philip, your idea is not without merit, Alexander agreed with him. But the fact remains that people need investment in order to succeed. It's a wise move that you declined their offer. So without money, were you able to complete your project? Philip shook his head. No, sir, I hit a wall. There's something missing. What's the problem? So when I turned it on, the image won't stick on the screen. It just flutters white dots and lines that don't make sense. An image won't stick on the screen? Alexander placed a finger on his lips. Wait, that's a simple problem, eh? Philip blinked at him, confused. Alexander smirked slightly. Have you thought of using cesium as a coating material? Cesium? Philip echoed questionably. Alexander nodded. Yes, cesium. The problem you're facing is that you needed a way for the negatively charged electrons that got shot across the cathode ray tube to stick to the surface of the screen. Upon Alexander's explanation, an idea struck Philip's head. Oh, positive and negative, opposites attract, so the coating needs to be the most positive element, and cesium is the most positive element, Philip gasped, his eyes sparkled with joy. Sir, I need to get back to work. I think I have figured it out. Whoa, slow down Philip, Alexander smiled, amused by his enthusiastic reaction to his words. Why sir? Once I coated the screen with cesium, it could deliver a favorable result. Don't worry sir, I'll be sure to credit your suggestion. No. Alexander stopped him from speaking by placing a hand on his shoulder. I understand that you're very excited and looking forward to testing it right now. But sir, you invited me here to hear about my project, right? Now I can work on it. Why are you stopping me? Alexander tilted his head to the side. Wait? What did you think was my intention of sending you out a letter and inviting you here across the sea? Huh? Isn't that obvious, sir? You're interested in my product and you'll invest in it. Philip spoke as though it was the most obvious thing in the world. Alexander sighed. You got it wrong. I'm not interested in your product. I'm interested in your skill and knowledge. What? Philip dumbfoundedly stared at Alexander. What do you mean, sir? Alexander breathed deeply before revealing his intention. I've already perfected the television in my workshop and I want you to be the one to handle the business for this invention. Philip stood stunned in front of Alexander, trying to absorb what he had just said. Why, you perfected it? Philip whispered, his voice cracking. Come and let me show it to you. Alexander walked over to a far back center wall where they found a square object covered in a brown curtain. Philip followed and watched as Alexander placed his hand on top of it and removed the covering from it, revealing what looked to be a wooden box but with a wide square mirror at its center and two knobs on the right side of the screen. What Philip was looking at right now was a television modeled after Zenith's 22-inch black and white television introduced in the 1950s. It's different from what Philip was building. No way, is this television? How can it be this big? There are a lot of bigger parts in the interior but I can assure you, it works like a charm. Alexander smiled as he inserted the power plug into a small outlet on the left side of the television. He waited patiently for the machine to turn on and then turned to Philip, who couldn't help but gape at the machine with awe shining in his blue eyes. The television flickered a few times to start up the system before eventually coming to life on a small flickering white light. It produced a white noise sound of static, which was normal because there was no signal coming through. Well, there was no signal, to begin with. To let this television out in the world, Alexander must create a broadcasting network, which is part of his plan. What you're looking at right now, Philip, is the future and will surely find its place in history. Alexander turned to face Philip, who was mesmerized by the flickering white and black dots and lines on the screen. Do you want to be part of history? Philip snapped out of the trance upon hearing that question. Of course, I'd love to, Sir Alexander. His expression was full of fervor. Excellent, this is what we are going to do.